Al Suarez, Venezuelan Embassy Protector, journalist, and recently has been involved in anti-racist organizing, um, Jacksonville, Florida area. How are you today? How's it been?
How's it going, comrade? A lot has happened in these past couple months since I moved to Northeast Florida in the midst of these protests and revolutionary scenarios. And I've been trying to speak out on behalf of the working class and Latinos, in particular, with emphasis on Black and Brown unity here in both um, Duval counties, Jacksonville, and also neighboring St. John County, St. Augustine.
Right on. I saw you made a fiery speech about the legality of tear gas. And can you tell us a little bit about your experiences or and your organizing with the current Black Lives Matter protest? Last time we spoke, we actually were speaking about Ahmaud Arbery down your way, and now looks like the country is in outrage over the latest lynching of George Floyd. Can you tell us a little bit about your organizing and experience there?
Yeah, so May 29th was the day of the two tear gas attacks here in downtown Jacksonville. And the next day, on the 30th, I gave a speech in St. Augustine about what transpired. And also, I believe on May 30th, later that day, I was live on RT International, the first time I'd ever been on RT, exposing the tear gas attack. And somebody had warned me, they said, "You're in Northeast Florida. You can't talk about revolution." And you know what I did? I went on the stage there in St. Augustine and I talked about revolution. And the people that were at the front row, the Flagler students, radicals, the one have been taking the lead on these protests in St. Augustine. They were applauding so loud that you could barely hear what I was saying. But when I said the word revolution, the youth, the vanguard of this movement, were enthralled by that because they had been defining the events of the day before as riot, as looting, as potential for civil war. And I said, this not only was not a riot, nor a civil war, nor even really a protest. What happened yesterday was a revolution. And when I said that, the people in the front row, the students, went wild. And it really comes to show, I was warned there's going to be some moderates in the crowd. You're in Northeast Florida. But I really felt it was important to define what happened the day before on May 29th. Now, I have video evidence. I was live the entire time. I believe you saw that video. It's an 18-minute video, approximately. And there were people behind me that had dropped their phones, that were grabbed by the SWAT team, the Gestapo forces that were converging on us. But I was able to get out some way. I mean, I've been an activist for 9 years. I've been in some tense situations. But for example, must have been New Year's Eve 2011. We were doing tug of war with the police at Occupy New York. Uh, and, we had the barricades and we outnumbered the cops because they were mostly down in Times Square and we had many comrades with us. So, for example, we're pulling the barricades because we make Mount Liberty with it. We built this on the first day of 2012. Around midnight, we were able to successfully build Mount Liberty with the police barricades and reoccupy Zuccotti Park um, because they've been shut down prior to that. And so while we're doing tug of war with the police and we're winning, the cops get pissed off and literally over my shoulder, pepper spray is used. And my comrade, who's 18 at the time, I believe, from Boston, he took a direct hit. So that's the closest I've been to, you know, pepper spray. But I've never experienced tear gas. And in that video, I think I was choking for a good 30 seconds. It was pretty bad. I was not expecting a second attack. So what happened was on May 29th, we peacefully protested during the day. And the initial protests had no clashes with the police whatsoever. And so I did what most comrades did. I went home. Then I got a phone call. They're using tear gas. And I went in my vehicle and I drove as fast as I could without going way over the speed limit, not to get pulled over. And I went as close as I possibly could to where these actions were taking place because I wanted to be there. And so I parked. It was like a Burger King parking lot, as close as I could get. And I'm walking, and I start going live, and I run into one of the comrades, and I say, "Have they regrouped? Where's the remaining comrades?" And they pointed me where I need to go. Literally, if I had arrived at the scene maybe 30 seconds later, I wouldn't have been there for that. So I got there right in time for the second attack. And I proved incontestably with my video that we were not a threat. There was only about 20 comrades. Now that I reanalyzed the video, it seemed more at the time, but we only had about 20 comrades left. We were marching home. It was done. We were saying Black Lives Matter, and we were leaving. And the SWAT team was converging, and they fired directly without any warning whatsoever at us. And one of the brave comrades grabbed the canister and threw it back. And I believe the SWAT team didn't even have gas masks, so that kind of held them back a little bit. And then they did another attack, not tear gas, but where they were running up to try to grab us. And they did grab some more comrades that day. A few comrades were arrested. I was lucky to get out. But when they use that tear gas, a few seconds later, I start choking, and I've never experienced anything like this. And you see me in the video with the tears in my eyes, and I said, I'm willing to die. I'm not going to leave because I was urging the comrades that were around me, especially the youth, the younger ones who haven't been in major protests, to stay. I said we need to regroup and retake street by street. We can't leave, comrades. We can't. And it just went on from there, and then eventually I'm back where my vehicle is. But after that, I was more determined than ever to try to instill discipline in the comrades so this doesn't turn into a riotous situation, so that it can turn into a revolutionary scenario. Hence, I started that night the speech that I would give the next morning. I think it was around 11 a.m. after we did a little march in St. Augustine, about 30 miles south of here. And in the speech, I quote St. Augustine, the philosopher, and one of his known quotes, the city was named after him, St. Augustine, was an unjust law is not a law. And I urged the law enforcement that were present to not follow immoral orders. Uh, and so I think the people enjoyed the speech. There was some moderates that were there that helped organize the event that might have not liked it, but there was no booze. Especially the part of the crowd that had the Flagler students were enthralled by it. And then later I exposed what happened on the international press at RT International. So this all happened, coming into June. But since then, it's really been a struggle to be heard. A lot of people don't like the idea of black and brown unity. And I'm talking about activists, unfortunately. Um, for example, the other day, there was an Hispanic in a Walmart with his wife and little child who didn't speak English. And he didn't understand that the Walmart was closing. So they sent actually a black officer uh, to confront him. And all the officer would have had to do, I don't have my watch on, all the officer would have had to done is point at their watch and go like that. End of it. They would have immediately left. And so he punched him so hard. The officer punched this Hispanic man so hard in the face that he fell in front of his little daughter. She was no more than 3 or 4 years old, and his wife, who was screaming in terror, face bloodied. And then the president of the police union for Jacksonville, you know what he said in response to what happened?
What do you say?
He said it was justified. And did you see a response by Black Lives Matter or any other activist group here locally? Besides a Facebook post, no. They don't mention any of this in their speeches because there's nobody speaking out for Latinos. And guess what? It's true. St. Augustine, which ironically is the first town in North America where Spanish was spoken, has very few Hispanics. But here in Duval, there are over 63,000 Latinos. Did you know that? In the county where Jacksonville is, there's over 63,000 Hispanics, Latinos, Latinas, Latinx. Over 63,000. So, and this is not that big of a population here. It's a big town by landmass, but 63,000 is significant. And there's nobody speaking out for them. And so I'm trying to promote a black and brown unity event. And I'm trying to say it's not just about race. It's about the role of the police, and it's about social class. If that was a rich Hispanic who had the money to pay for a tutor to teach them English, they would have never been in that situation. It was a working class Hispanic with his family in a Walmart who was attacked, and nobody's speaking out about this. And so that's why it's important to reform Latino Lives Matter. I'm one of the co-founders from back in 2016 in Tampa, and to put it in the context of Black and Brown unity. We're not competing with our Black brothers and sisters. We need to work together, and we need to speak out for the working class, the oppressed, and the poor, who I mentioned in my speech as well. You don't hear people give speeches like that. They make it a Black issue. They make it a police issue. It's more than that. As revolutionaries, as socialists, as true progressives, we need to organize in our organization for this unity.
Wow. It's great. I'm glad you're getting that story out there. I haven't heard about that
It's
incident.
all on video.
I'm glad my viewers able to hear about that. Um, Recently, you made a video criticizing white activists for kissing the feet of black activists. Like, do you find this problematic? Can you tell us a little more about this?
See, people misunderstood the video. It was very controversial. Caleb Mockbin was kind enough to share it, and I think he agreed with it. He made a comment in support of it. Um, but yeah, it was very controversial, but people took it out of context. The video was not speaking to black people at all whatsoever. The video was speaking to white activists that show up with the intention to do what I've been seeing for several days. I kept my mouth shut, but just one day after the other, seeing these videos of whites in the middle of a protest, and a lot of it's just about getting attention to themselves. They don't really care about black people, but they show up, and they immediately find a black activist, and then they get on their knees and start kissing their feet, and then it's all on camera. It's a big publicity stunt, and that's going to turn off so many comrades from joining the cause. So I kept seeing that, and I said, you know what, I need to do a video about this. Now it caused so much controversy, several hundred people saw it, that I had to switch it to private. Public, it was too much, and then I changed the title because this is the title was too controversial. But I kept the video up, and I stand by it because it was not a video what they tried to misconstrue it as being critical of black activists. It was speaking to white activists with the intention to show up to kiss black people's feet. I just think that's wrong. That's a humiliation. Um, it's degrading. It's going to turn other comrades off that would show up and see something like that. And I think it's conducted by whites that are trying to get attention to themselves and make it a publicity stunt and not pay attention to the oppression of blacks and Latinos. And by the way, Dust, did you know that the number one demographic in the United States now for COVID cases are Latinos? Did you know that?
No, I know there's definitely disparities, but wow, that's
They have
uh,
surpassed now African Americans, and this is because of discrimination, because of socioeconomic situations. But now Latinos are number one in COVID cases. They don't talk about that in a city like Jacksonville. But in a few years, this is what Trump fears. Hispanics in my lifetime are going. The population is going to be on the increase. Maybe by the time I'm 50 or 60 years old, I'm 35 now, maybe as soon as 15 years, they say because of the growth of Latino population in the United States, that Latinos could become a majority of the nation. And think of if those Latinos were mostly progressive, like our Puerto Rican comrades. Think if those Latinos had strong ties to socialist governments south of the Rio Grande. If they became a majority of the population of the U.S. empire, think of the implications of that. And so that's why you have imperialists like Trump and his supporters that say make America great again. You know what they mean. And there have been Republicans that have run on this ticket with these words verbatim: make America white again. Just as Hitler's slogan when he ran as chancellor was make Germany great again, what he really meant was make Germany Aryan again. And so they want to maintain a white elite bourgeois control of the country. And that was another point I made. It was only a 3 minute speech, but that was another point I made in St. Augustine. I said, remember that they are in the minority. The elite are in the minority, and worldwide, black and brown and working class and poor are the majority of the world population. And also, the other day, I gave a speech not in front of a big crowd. Of course, they don't want like somebody like me to speak, but I gave a speech in front of a small crowd. I was doing a little Latino Lives Matter protest, And I had on my sign Black and Brown Unity, and many Black comrades came and expressed support for that. But I said, not only is Black and Brown Unity important, but so is Black and Red. I organized at Standing Rock. I helped start a camp in the Everglades with the Miccosukee and the Seminole people. So if you look at the history here in Florida, the Seminole Wars, including the Black Seminoles, who united with the runaway slaves, had defeated the U.S. Army 3 times. So back when the Spanish had control of Florida in their capital, St. Augustine, they said any runaway black who escapes Jamestown that comes to Florida that wants to live our way of life can be free and can live beside their Seminole brother and sister. So that was going on for a long time, up until the time of Harriet Tubman, when she led battalions in Jacksonville during the Civil War, or where she brought slaves to the Seminole people here. Um, they don't talk about that part of the history, and there's no Hollywood movie of that part of the Underground Railroad because they're afraid to show how strong they become when there's black and red unity. But yes, they defeated the U.S. Army in 3 wars in a row. So it wasn't just Vietnam where the U.S. was defeated versus yellow people. It was black and red unity. And when I had mentioned that with the few black activists that were around, hearing me say that with my Latino Lives Matter sign and my F Trump banner next to me, that caused some controversy, especially with the religious folk. But when they saw that, they were like, "Come on down to the Ritz Theater, man. We want to see you there." And it was Juneteenth, and on that same day, it was in the national press. You might have read about this, Dust. They had, I think this was Boogaloo guys trying to pin it on us, but they had, on the same day of Juneteenth, you're going to think black activists on the day that they freed the last of the slaves in Texas, that you heard about this, right? They got these dolls dressed as police officers, and they did like an imitation of lynching with ropes over the highway. I'm part of a brigade that puts banners up on the highways here in Jacksonville. But yeah, in the middle of the highway on Juneteenth, that same day that I was in downtown with my Latino Lives Matter sign, they had put a mock lynching of police officers in the middle of the highway in broad daylight. And then they try to blame it on us. It's ridiculous. These are these alt right boogaloo guys that want to pin it on us. But I know activists that have had their car slashed multiple times that are targets. And there's always the discussion: is it the cops because the cops admit in doing some things like that before? Is it the alt right? And I say they're one and the same. Look at the history, right? Like always look at the history, Dust. The original police in this country were slave catchers. That was their role. They were brought to search for the runaway slaves. And they hated when they got to Florida because they knew the Seminoles would protect them. And you don't see unity like that today. If you had red, black, brown, working class, poor unity in this country today with nearly 40 million Americans being laid off since COVID started, you have the revolutionary conditions there. But unfortunately, you have division, and you have these riotous situations where they're not organized, where they're not disciplined. They don't have the revolutionary leadership or the revolutionary discipline. And that's what I'm trying to instill in the youth and the Flagler students, for them to get educated on Marx, for them to get educated on the history of revolutions, the French, the Russian, etc. It's so important, education and building consciousness in these scenarios.
Wow, great history. Great examples. I haven't heard about that specific incidents. I know the Boogaloo, or what call them, they're very destructive, mindless reactionaries. It's scary. I'm glad you're exposing them. Um, I so it's difficult organizing in the South, even for black and brown unity and just basis things. What about talking about Venezuela and linking the struggles here, the oppression of imperialism here against poor black and brown, to the struggles of the anti-imperialists internationally? Have you had any good luck with getting that message out there?
Well, that's why we need to bring people like Sherry Honkala and Ajamu Baraka to Jacksonville when the RNC starts in August, because they always touch on that. I mean, Sherry had met Chavez. Baraka is a frequent traveler to Colombia and is supporting leftist groups there. And these are people that were on the national stage in the alternative parties movement, right? So they built coalitions. Both of them ran for vice president in 2012 and 2016 alongside Jill Stein for the Green Party. And they tried to push that party more to the left, far more to the left than the Democrats are. And so, yes, that's why it's important that they come down for these RNC protests that we're setting up. to speak on that, could speak about the black and brown people that are in Latin America and their struggle to have a socialist government in Venezuela, in spite of pressures from the U.S. empire. Um, so yes, that's something that should be tied to it, and I always try to do that. I had very few minutes to speak at St. Augustine to tie it to that. We were planning a Black and Brown Unity event in July. Perhaps I could speak on it then. Um, but actually, one of the good things about Bernie Sanders in 2020 versus 2016 is that his policy on Latin America and Venezuela in particular was much better this time, and that's because a lot of the burners that joined up in 2020 were Chavista, or were at least sympathetic to Maduro and the Chavista movement in Venezuela. So I think that Bernie felt the pressure and got more educated about what was going on down there and was much less critical and even in some ways supportive, including Evo Morales. He was very critical of the coup against Evo Morales, unlike AOC. But Bernie was very critical of the coup against Evo Morales. And the New York Times, since the coup against Evo last year, has come out and it was, what was it, December last year, the coup. But yeah, so the coup in Bolivia, the New York Times had claimed that the OAS had evidence that there was rigging, and then the New York Times was forced to come out and say there is no evidence. They've never provided it. The Organization of American States has basically lied to try to foment the coup against the progressive indigenous leader Evo Morales in Bolivia. And New York Times, this is not the first time they've done something like this, right? So you might remember that the New York Times reported that Maduro had blew up a quote unquote humanitarian truck on the Colombo Venezuelan border, right? So that was on the front page, and we had been telling them that we have video from our comrades on the ground showing the oppositionists burning their own truck. And I don't know if it was 1 month or 2 months later. This was about a year ago. This happened, right? So a few weeks passed, and finally, the New York Times, of course, in the back of the newspaper, had to retract and say, yes, we found out that it was the opposition that did this. But this is what the bourgeois press does. They will sensationalize, and then when it comes time to saying the truth, they're going to put it on the back page.
Tell us a little more about your organizing around the RNC. I know originally they were supposed to have it here in North Carolina, but our governor, one of the few things you've done positive was say no, they're not going to have big mass rallies here. Now it's down your way. So what's going on with the organizing?
Well, in a way, your governor's done me a favor, right? Because he brought the revolution down here. And it's funny because I was one of the founders of the Romneyville camp in the area where you're not supposed to camp in downtown Tampa 8 years ago for the RNC back then. So I have some experience, and some of the activists that don't have large egos and actually want Black and Brown unity that I've been speaking to, in particular from the Our Revolution group, are willing to work with me to help organize the protest here and to bring down comrades like Reverend Bruce Wright, Sherry Hankala, quite possibly Ajamu Baraka as well. And so, and also Code Pink and Medea Benjamin, of course. So, and I worked with them back 8 years ago as well. So if they come down, that's going to mean it's serious. And we're going to have to set up housing. I heard as high as 10,000 comrades could potentially come down to protest the RNC. But then there's figures as high as 100,000 Republicans, right? But how many of them are going to want to come and actually counter protest us, right? And they're going to go down to stay in their bougie hotels and drink their champagnes and enjoy their soirees with local conservative rich people. That's what they're going to do. They're not going to be concerned with going to the streets or being militant, except for their alt-right faction. There's going to be a scenario where you need to prepare people. In these next few weeks, if there are people that don't know basic self-defense or martial arts, they're going to have to learn it. It could be like a civil war in the streets during the RNC. But the question is, once they leave, does that mean these protests should die down? They actually had the largest protest in Jacksonville's history the other day. I was there for the beginning of it, larger than when Dr. King was down here. It was 8,000 people. Um, but if we get 10,000 comrades to converge in different parts of the city protesting simultaneously, where it's hard for the cops to control it, or even the military, because it's a very large area by landmass, we could really show the world that progressives still have a voice here during COVID. So, but what I'm concerned about is when the RNC leaves, what's going to change, right? We need structural, institution, systemic changes to the imperialist system. It's not just about removal of statues. I went down the other day and gave a speech to St. Augustine, in a very brief speech, just trying to convince the city council people to remove those statues, as they had done in Jacksonville prior. All this happened recently in the past few weeks. And in a 3-2 decision, they voted to remove them. But that's just symbolic, right? That's just the first step. You have to do more than just remove statues. And actually, one of the guys, I looked him up, one of the city council people who voted to keep the statue in public, because we weren't even calling for the statue's destruction, just to move them to a museum, was a guy with an Hispanic last name. I looked him up. He's from Tampa, John Valdez. And Valdez, he's a white Hispanic. I believe he's Cuban, maybe third or fourth generation. There's a lot of old Cubans, old school Cubans that come from Tampa. And I'm thinking to myself, how can an Hispanic vote? The grandson or great grandson of immigrants, could vote for something like that, to maintain the Confederate monument and these symbols of hate. And I believe one of the counter protesters that showed up against Reverend Rawl and my other comrades that were with me that day in St. Augustine was Hispanic. He looked very Hispanic. And I'm thinking, how can these people sell out? But then I also think, where's the voice calling for black and brown unity? Where's the events where they're going to enable the voice calling for this unity? And I think you have a lot more leeway because the activist community is smaller in St. Augustine and the organizers have smaller egos. So down there's a lot more leeway to speak out. So I'm thinking, and it's appropriate, it's the first town in North America where Spanish was spoken, that we have a Latino Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter event. And there's different groups. It's like, no, we're the real blue Black Lives Matter. It's just situations of ego. But really, you have to deflate your egos when you come in that room and leave your ego at the door and work for the greater good when you're building coalition. And in my 19 years of activism, I've learned that you have to build coalition, you have to make compromises, but with principles.
Let's see. We're 27 minutes in. We got about 3 minutes left. Maybe just go half an hour. What are your first up? What are the date? Do you know the dates of the RNC? Um,
It's late August. I
Late
believe it's
August.
the week after the DNC. The DNC is going to be only 5,000 elites meeting in Milwaukee.
Hmm.
They won't even bring in the delegates. They're afraid of what the burners can do. So yeah, after the DNC is done, RNC is going to start, and hopefully by then I'll be enrolled for my master's at a UNF. If the classes are online, I'll probably postpone my studies for another semester because I much prefer where I can engage with the professor, especially debate. I like to debate, but if you debate a professor too much, you can get in trouble. But yeah, these things should be going on in late August. Yeah, this is funny, right? Because the professor doesn't matter. I mean, doesn't mind when you debate other students in class. Well, you start taking them to task. They're like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be the professor here. I'm supposed to be the demigod, right? You gotta be careful about that because it affects your grade.
I've had similar experiences. Let's see. In the last 2 minutes or so, um, maybe we can focus on like the broader issues. You mentioned how this repression of black, brown, and poor folks here um, is part of imperialism. How
Internal
do we
imperialism.
build power to dismantle these forms of oppression? Like, what's your long term strategy or your outlook? Like,
We need to define what is going on as not a riot. We need to redefine what these things are. I don't call it looting; I call it economic justice. As far as I'm concerned, if these are corporations that are maintaining starvation wages and benefiting from corporate socialism, the working class has a right to react. We are not agitators. We are responding to the agitation of the system. So we can no longer define this as just a protest or just another riot like the LA riots or the 1968 riots. This is a revolutionary scenario. And once we define that, and once we educate the masses and instill that consciousness, we can start to fight to build that new society.
well, that's a great line to end it on. Thanks